You're hunting for a place in Canada where your social security check actually survives the month. But every cheap housing promise hides a price. Tonight, we map 10 affordable cities that tempt with low rent and small town calm, yet test you with harsh winters, isolation, underpaid jobs, safety trade-offs, and quirks only locals understand. We'll weigh cost of living against real quality of life, read the demographics behind the postcard, and ask whether the economy, migration patterns, and survival math truly add up. If a bargain exists, we'll find it and expose what you sacrifice to keep it. Part 1. Atlantic Stretch. New Brunswick Trio. Number 10. Moncton, NB. Moncton wears its price on the outside, and the paint wears its years on the inside. However, the rent band hovering around $700 to $850 changes the tempo of a Social Security month, turning panic into planning. Even so, the number that lodges in the mind is $750 if you accept walls with more history than Netflix, which is both joke and ledger. Therefore, the first clue is simple affordability, and the second is what it quietly asks back. Keep your shovel near the door. The city's size is the second note, not too large to drown you, not too small to starve you. However, a mid-sized roster of services lands softly for retirees, with decent hospitals and appointments that arrive before worry turns to pain. Meanwhile, the small airport becomes a pressure valve for families that live 2 provinces away or for quick hops to bigger hubs when necessary. Even so, convenience here is not glamour, it is mercy. Pack warm gloves for the runway. The cost basket stays disciplined when the weather does not. However, electricity and natural gas duel through late winter, and every degree below zero writes itself onto the month's bill. Meanwhile, a typical one-bedroom still leaves room for groceries, data, and a coffee that tastes like a plan. Even so, the savings you celebrate in February are the ones you rightly negotiated in October. Insulation is wealth in wool. By the way, if you don't subscribe, you'll keep chasing cheap homes without knowing the real traps they hide. Subscribe and uncover the true cost of affordable living in Canada. Spring in Moncton is a moving target that brings surprises you can schedule. However, snow in April has a habit of pretending it is still invited, and rain in May insists on ownership of your doorstep. Meanwhile, by June, the mosquitoes table their own tax, collecting a percentage of your patience at dusk. Even so, the rhythm teaches you to live between windows, seasons, and screens. Silence hums like a net. The neighborhoods greet you the way a diner greets regulars, by what you order and how you tip. However, the friendly nods are not performative. They are the currency of small city peace. Meanwhile, the smell of reheated poutine in a kitchen that refuses to apologize at midnight is a kind of cultural truth. Even so, low rent buys the right to be known, and that may be the best line item. Carry your name like a handshake. The catch, of course, is inside the walls. However, older interiors can be as stubborn as a landlord's shrug, with layers of paint that remembers every previous tenant by color. Meanwhile, damp corners and shoulder season test your patience and your dehumidifier in equal measure. Even so, routine maintenance is the rent under the rent, and it pays dividends in comfort. Keep the fan running after showers. Hospitals and clinics deserve the same scrutiny you give bricks and mortar. However, a snapshot of wait times tells you how fast pain turns to paperwork and whether the system exhale matches your inhale. Meanwhile, knowing which departments move faster saves hours and blood pressure. Even so, healthcare access is not a luxury here, it is a pillar. Learn the front desk names early. If fog beats bugs, head down the bay. Number 9. St. John, NB. St. John looks like a postcard until the mist takes its brush back. However, the rent hovers around $750 to $900, and the arithmetic feels almost theatrical when the harbor exhale drifts across the porch. Meanwhile, groceries remain reasonable enough that a basket can still feel like storage rather than triage. Even so, the line you remember is a one-bedroom for $780 with a foggy view included. The view charges in silence. The city's charm is inseparable from its edges. However, the Bay of Fundy is both neighbor and mood, erasing the horizon and drawing it again before the kettle knows what time it is. Meanwhile, that ritual makes mornings slower, softer, and sometimes late. Even so, slow can be a strategy when your monthly income asks for fewer detours. The tide keeps the clock. Housing stock shows its age like a family photo album. However, pre-1960 homes make a street look noble at noon and drafty at midnight if you do not check the windows. Meanwhile, with the right inspection and a practical landlord, the romance becomes sustainable rather than decorative. Even so, history needs new caulk, and it will take it gladly. Old wood does whisper. The economy here does not strut, it limps and recovers and limps again. However, for a retiree, employment cycles matter less than service reliability and clinic hours. Meanwhile, the city's calm community culture tends to fill gaps with volunteer networks and neighbor duty. Even so, the softness of pace is an asset, not a flaw. Stillness can be infrastructure. Fog, of course, is not just a view, it is logistics. However, transit reliability and storm cancellations add a small tax to spontaneity, and the route home sometimes redrafts itself. Meanwhile, a flood and sea level exposure map is not a bureaucratic artifact, it is a future photograph. Even so, risk properly priced becomes peace properly earned. Watch the driveway after storms. Crime comes as rumor more often than reality, but rumor does not lock doors. However, neighborhood crime maps explain how to draw your nightly rectangle and keep it small. Meanwhile, the best streets show their character at 9 in the evening when the last dog is walked. Even so, 780 means more when serenity comes free. Choose the late light corner.
Number 8. Fredericton, NB. Fredericton steps differently, like a metronome set to policy and parks. However, for a retiree, provincial capital orderliness is more than a phrase. It is a timetable that begins on time. Meanwhile, the rent band near $750 to $900 meets the same fixed check with better posture. Even so, the memory that endures is retiring for roughly $770, where mosquitoes attempt to levy their own taxes. They collect only at dusk. The St. John River is not scenery, it is a climate instrument. However, humid summers make windows second opinions, and snowbanks in winter become furniture you learn to navigate with humor. Meanwhile, a dehumidifier and a good shovel are not purchases, they are extensions of your handshake with the city. Even so, rhythm replaces inconvenience when you accept it. Seasons are negotiations. Services arrive with the grace of repetition. However, hospital and clinic density eases anxiety, especially for those measuring months and medicine side by side. Meanwhile, community programming for seniors turns weekdays into rituals that raise the temperature of social life. Even so, the best therapy remains a river bench with a thermos and a plan. Sit where the water repeats. Demographics tell their own quiet story here. However, a median age tempered by university pulse keeps the streets from feeling retired even when you are. Meanwhile, the cadence of semesters brings concerts, lectures, and coffee lines that forgive hesitation with a smile. Even so, being older among learners is not alienation, it is a discount on boredom. The syllabus leaks outward. Parks knit the neighborhoods together more than storefronts do. However, access to green space matters when fixed income stretches further outdoors than in shops. Meanwhile, trails cut through schedules and reroute anxiety toward movement rather than worry. Even so, a cheap apartment near trees is often a better apartment than a cheaper one near noise. Leaves are instruments. Utilities and internet are the bolts on the frame of the month. However, stable speeds at fair prices keep telemedicine practical and grandchildren reachable without apology. Meanwhile, heating bills make their biannual attempt to dominate, and you answer with weather stripping and layered habits. Even so, thrift here feels strategic rather than desperate. Blankets become policy. Culture rarely announces itself loudly in Fredericton, but it arrives anyway. However, small festivals, craft markets, and bookish corners fold into a week until the week becomes a place. Meanwhile, the cost of entry remains low, which means participation is not a luxury. Prefer to trade English small talk for baguettes and blizzards? The next chapter answers softly in French. Part 2. The Francophone Bargain, Quebec Core. Number 7. Trois-Rivières, QC. Trois-Rivières sits exactly where maps like to fold, halfway between Montreal and Quebec City, and your dollar seems to fold with it. However, the key is that rents around $750 to $850 are not accidents. They are policy expressed as geography and winter. Meanwhile, that midpoint location turns day trips into habits and specialist appointments into simple triangles. Even so, the real currency here is familiarity, not distance. Buses keep the promise. The streets hold their breath in January the way bakeries exhale in July, and both become part of your budget. However, the long winter means heating is a line item you respect before it demands respect. Meanwhile, freeze days tally like beads on a string, and each bead adds a small surcharge to comfort. Even so, insulation closes the distance to spring. Caulk is language. Language is not a garnish in Trois-Rivières, it is the plate. However, for Social Security retirees, a basic working French uncorks more than conversation. It reduces small frictions that compound into fatigue. Meanwhile, pharmacy counters, municipal offices, and clinic desks ease open when you release a simple bonjour and a patient smile. Even so, effort earns discounts on silence. Politeness is infrastructure. The old neighborhoods wear cobblestones like bracelets, and the apartments above storefronts carry more stories than space. However, checking windows, radiators, and bathroom fans turns romance into reliability in one afternoon. Meanwhile, a building older than your favorite record still warms quickly if the seals are new and the boiler is loved. Even so, age becomes charm when the draft is gone. Paint should not flutter. Groceries tell the truth about a place faster than pamphlets do, and here the basket mixes cheese, soup bones, and humility. However, the grocery bill sits below Montreal's by a meaningful margin, especially if you adopt local brands without ceremony. Meanwhile, bakeries in this town multiply temptations, and those temptations are cheaper than regret. Even so, bread is cheaper than boredom in winter. Warmth smells like yeast. Healthcare access links the romantic to the necessary in one step, and retirees learn that step on week 1. However, wait times shift by clinic and by month, which means you win the game by booking earlier than you think reasonable. Meanwhile, a small private policy bridging provincial eligibility can make the first season feel less like roulette. Even so, anxiety is more expensive than premiums. Calendars are medicine. Crime tends to hide behind statistics if you let it, but streets speak plainly after dusk. However, the safest corners are the ones that look modest in photos and predictable in person. Meanwhile, the bargain you want is not cheapest, it is quietest per dollar within walking distance. Even so, tranquility compounds in 12-month returns. Neighbors are dividends. Culture does not arrive by parade here, it arrives like snow, slow, steady, and suddenly everywhere. However, the festival calendar knits the year together so completely that the year starts to look like a scarf. Meanwhile, museum afternoons and cafe evenings build a new price index where conversation is the cost and pleasure the surplus. Even so, this surplus looks good on a fixed income. Time takes like cinnamon. If you want more green in med schools, keep south. Number 6. Sherbrooke, QC. Sherbrooke greets you with campus energy and hillside streets that roll like sentences, and then it hands you a receipt that feels light. However, The rent band around $750 to $850 delivers space for medications, good tea, and the kind of groceries that make soup a ritual. Meanwhile, the hook is the healthcare network because university cities attract specialists the way libraries attract raincoats. Even so, proximity is its own subsidy. Clinics blink first. Nature stands 5 minutes away in any direction and insists you come see what it has done with the afternoon. However, trails and likes lower the price of mood more effectively than any streaming bundle. Meanwhile, winter tries to interrupt this arrangement with storms that turn sidewalks into CrossFit, and you respond by walking anyway. Even so, movement is cheaper than melancholy. Boots beat couches. Student churn gives the city a restless heartbeat that retirees can borrow without paying interest. However, that churn also means some apartments feel recycled, clever, and not quite finished, so you inspect like a librarian and sign like a judge. Meanwhile, a recycled student flat at $780 can become a sanctuary the day you buy a proper lamp. Even so, light makes rooms tell the truth. Corners should glow. Language tilts toward French as firmly as a chair with one leg shorter than the others, yet people steady it for you if you try. However, doctors and receptionists in Sherbrooke pronounce last names that scare airport scanners, and they do it with a competence that dissolves fear. Meanwhile, your prescriptions travel through systems that favor clarity over ceremony. Even so, gratitude is the shortest sentence to master. Merci travels far. The job market may be narrow for workers, but for retirees it means prices behave and traffic apologizes. However, quiet economies force services to be honest because reputation spreads faster than buses. Meanwhile, the cafe that remembers your mug also remembers you asked for less salt last week. Even so, the premium you stop paying is inconvenience. Routines become interest. Transit connects to Montreal with the regularity of a good habit, and that corridor keeps your world wider than your street. However, when snow flirts with theatrics, schedules twitch and you plan like a chess player rather than a gambler. Meanwhile, intercity routes protect grandchildren's visits from becoming expensive epics. Even so, a backup plan is cheaper than a panic. Tickets love backups. Property taxes in these corners of Quebec sit where they can be noticed but not feared if you choose carefully. However, the budget that matters is the winter budget, and that budget listens to insulation more than it does to slogans. Meanwhile, your electric bill and your coat develop a working relationship that stabilizes February. Even so, thrift here looks like preemptive kindness. Drafts should lose. Groceries balance imported cravings with local habits, and the balance determines whether your month breathes or wheezes. However, a move towards staples that enjoy bilingual labels reduces the cost of nostalgia without canceling it. Meanwhile, the cheese remains suspiciously affordable for its personality, which is the sort of scandal you will forgive. Even so, comfort should not bankrupt curiosity. Try the local loaf. Safety sits at the level of street names and porch lights, and Sherbrooke's porch lights are talkative. However, you still walk the block at 9 to learn which corners avoid performative noise. Meanwhile, the crime trend line behaves like a good neighbor, steady, boring, and almost invisible. Even so, lock the door and keep the peace. Caution costs little. Culture mingles with medicine in this town, and that mingling makes weeks accelerate. However, lectures, gallery openings, and student concerts provide more calendar than weather can erase. Meanwhile, you even start to schedule storms as listening sessions for music you pretended to have outgrown. Even so, growth is cheaper here than in cities that charge for it. Curiosity lowers rent. Utilities and internet act like backstage crew, unseen until they stumble, and Sherbrooke's crew largely hits their marks. However, speeds hold for telemedicine and calls home, and outages announce themselves like polite throat clears rather than drama. Meanwhile, winter still extracts its tax, but your habits learn to pay in small coins. Even so, resilience is a budget category now. Habits print money.
The old motif returns because it never left. Cheap always has a catch, but here the catch speaks two languages and smiles. However, the second motif stomps back in with salt on its boots. Winter taxes your soul, and you learn to claim deductions in bread, books, and friends. Meanwhile, the quiet at night is not emptiness. It is the third motif. Silence is never silent, because radiators whisper and snow says hush. Even so, hush can be wealth when the rent is fair. Quiet earns interest. Trade croissants for cryotherapy, and the prairies await with a different arithmetic.
Part 3. Prairie Reality Check. Number 5. Brandon, MB. Brandon steps out quietly with a number that can reset your month, and the number often lands near $700 for a one-bedroom. However, the bargain turns serious the moment the wind takes your breath and your plans in the same motion. Meanwhile, at 20 below, you learn that insulation is the currency that matters most. Your freezer becomes metaphor. The city is Manitoba's second largest and wears that badge like a denim jacket, useful and unpretentious. However, that scale means you get groceries, clinics, and mechanics without the theater of big city prices or delays. Meanwhile, the walking you do in September becomes the gym you earn in January. Sidewalks become tests. Heating bills are the headline in a place where cold is not a season but a season leader. However, the cheapest rent can become expensive when draft sneaks through baseboards and whispers numbers into your utility statement. Meanwhile, a decent weather strip and a small space heater can change your fate for pennies a day. Warmth is policy. Cars here are less accessory and more lifeline, and that reality writes another line into your budget. However, the distance to the nearest airport with serious options is a reminder that cheap often arrives with longer roads. Meanwhile, routine becomes prevention as you winterize early and schedule maintenance before storms grow names. Routes are strategies. Groceries and fuel form a duet that you conduct with care, and both respond well to timing. However, you learn the beat of flyers, discounts, and local produce the way a drummer learns fills. Meanwhile, your cart becomes a weekly referendum on habit versus impulse. Habit usually wins. Safety in Brandon feels domestic rather than dramatic when you pick the right block and learn its rhythm. However, you still walk it at night before you sign, because quiet can hide both peace and neglect. Meanwhile, neighbors who wave are often the cheapest security system you will ever install. Waving saves money. Healthcare capacity matters more than Romer, and Brandon's hospital grid is compact but functional. However, the trick is booking ahead for non-urgent issues so the urgent ones find space. Meanwhile, small city nurses remember faces the way clerks remember names, and both are currency if you use them kindly. Courtesy speeds care. By the way, skip subscribing, and the next time you see a bargain house, you won't know the winters, the crime, or the silence that come with it. Subscribe now before you buy into the illusion. Culture arrives in small rooms here, not grand halls, and it arrives steady rather than loud. However, a local hockey night and a farmer's market can carry an entire weekend under one coat. Meanwhile, you learn that boredom is a decision you can reverse with one bus ride. Plans beat weather. Want bigger amenities at small city prices? Next stop. Number 4. Winnipeg, MB. Winnipeg does not pretend the winter is gentle. It admits the slap and dares you to budget around it. However, the rent in many neighborhoods lingers between $750 and $900, and that range pulls a fixed income back from the cliff. Meanwhile, the city answers with arts, parks, and a hockey schedule that treats darkness like an opponent. The arena sells warmth. Neighborhoods are the plot twists of Winnipeg, and you map them like chapters. However, a rent heat line shows where a bargain is a bargain and where a bargain is a misdirection. Meanwhile, the right street lets you save money without paying and worry. Street names matter. Wind chill is not a rumor here. It is the author of many evenings and the editor of your wardrobe. However, records in the -30s are not statements of defeat. They are instructions to layer and to respect timing. Meanwhile, bus stops teach patience and boots explain why haste costs energy. Layers are contracts. Property taxes and utilities join the conversation like old friends who still split the bill fairly. However, the true price is set by how tightly your windows close and how quickly your building staff answers a text. Meanwhile, a small repair in December is worth triple in January. Fast fixes save months. Culture density is the Winnipeg curveball that budget skeptics never saw coming. However, galleries, festivals, and winter lights smuggle sunlight into a calendar that refuses to brighten on command. Meanwhile, you find yourself paying $10 for an evening that feels like a city twice the price. Art changes math. Transit is punctual more often than theatrical, and that is the right way around when the weather sneers. However, some routes go sleepy after dinner, which means you plan like an accountant with a scarf. Meanwhile, ride-sharing fills the gaps without draining the month if you keep your circles tight. Circles cut costs. Healthcare access spreads across a network that rewards those who do paperwork before pain arrives. However, telemedicine matters on nights when the wind decides the rules and strong internet becomes a health device. Meanwhile, pharmacies bridge the distance with delivery options that were once luxuries, now normal. Delivery buys time. Insurance premiums play tag with neighborhood trends, and you monitor both like two halves of a weather map. However, the affordable parts of Winnipeg still let you breathe without adding adrenaline to your commute. Meanwhile, your snow shovel becomes a symbol of participation rather than complaint. Shoveling builds trust. Prefer a smaller capital with ruler-straight streets? Keep moving. Let's go with number 3, Regina, SK. Regina greets you with a grid that even a daydreamer can navigate, and that simplicity feels like a gift to a retiree. However, a rent around $700 to $800 threatens to make you careless if you ignore the wind's personality. Meanwhile, the catch here is not hidden in the lease, it is written across the sky. Wind writes contracts. The city's services are distributed like checkboxes waiting for a pencil, and that predictability is a relief to anyone managing medication and routine. However, the cost advantage only holds if your winter plan involves more than hope and a light jacket. Jackets tell truths. Parks and a central lake cut through the grid like green relief, and they become purpose rather than scenery. However, in February, the path around the water can feel like an expedition that earns lunch for free. Meanwhile, spring repays winter in bursts of public life that feel almost orchestral. Benches hold secrets. Crime in Regina behaves like a storyline with recurring characters, and you keep it out of your episode by casting your street wisely. However, a trend line matters less than the block you choose and the eyes you meet when you step outside. Meanwhile, community programs for seniors anchor corners that might otherwise drift. Programs save nerves. Healthcare access points sit where they should, and appointments land within the patience of a retiree who has learned when to call. However, the waiting room teaches you that bringing a book is a skill that saves spirits on cold afternoons. Pharmacists often remember your first name after your second visit and use it like a bridge. Names melt ice. Property taxes and municipal fees are the bones of your budget and rarely break if you keep the rest of the body strong. However, the bill you feel most is still the one the furnace sends at midnight. Meanwhile, draft-proofing a modest apartment writes more poetry than any snowflake can erase. Proofing is poetry. Social life here is scheduled rather than accidental, and that suits many who are done gambling on spontaneity. However, senior recreation programs turn gymnasiums into neighborhoods and classes into tiny countries where everyone shares the same weather. Meanwhile, coffee after Tai Chi becomes both ritual and insurance against isolation. Rituals beat cold. The sky over Regina can look empty at first, but emptiness is an illusion invented by city glare. However, on clear nights, the stars feel close enough to borrow, and in those moments, a cheap rent becomes a stage rather than a refuge. Meanwhile, your hat may still try for orbit when the gusts arrive, so you tie it like a promise. Stars lower rent. The Prairie trilogy writes the same line in 3 handwritings, and the line says that affordability survives as long as you respect the elements that created it. However, respect is simply the habit of preparation meeting the habit of patience, and both can be learned without buying anything new. Meanwhile, the next map point trades wind for water and isolation for coastline. The compass turns east again. Craving water, cliffs, and moose instead of wheat and wind, the road bends toward a lake so large it invents its own weather, and then farther to a city where rain walks sideways like it owns the street. Even so, cheap can still buy charm when you pay with awareness rather than denial. The edge of the map is calling now.
Part 4. Edge of Map Finals. Number 2. Thunder Bay, Ontario. Thunder Bay sits where the Shield meets a sea of fresh water and pretends it is only a city, though the lake insists otherwise. However, the rent band hovering between $750 and $900 opens space in a Social Security month that elsewhere would snap tight. Meanwhile, the line that lingers is $780 with a lake view and more moose than neighbors if you pick your street with care. The lake signs the lease. The first condition of this affordability is isolation drawn in miles rather than metaphors, and those miles carry consequences. However, airline routes come and go like seasons, and a ticket can feel like a negotiation with geography rather than commerce. Meanwhile, planning 3 weeks ahead becomes as natural as checking the weather, and both reduce the price of surprise. Calendars are shields. Lake Superior writes its own winter doctrine and sometimes adds a postscript in May, then laughs quietly. However, lake effect snow turns driveways into small ski resorts, and your shovel learns choreography you will perform by heart. Meanwhile, the cold here is clean and declarative, which is both punishment and mercy when you dress correctly. Layers outsmart latitude. Hospitals serve a vast northern catchment, and that reality lines the corridors with more stories than chairs. However, retirees who treat appointments like chess, not roulette, discover care that arrives on time more often than rumor suggests. Meanwhile, telemedicine rides on the back of decent internet, which is less luxury than Lifeline in a whiteout. Screens shorten distance. Groceries sit on a knife edge between remote and reasonable, and the basket responds to your strategy. However, chain stores soften the peaks while local markets season the month with produce and smoked fish that taste like a treaty with winter. Meanwhile, prices knot upward with freight, then bow back down with discipline and timing. Flyers are maps. Property taxes, heating, and insurance behave if you prepare, which is not a poetic sentence, but it is the one that saves money. However, the apartment you choose must be tight against drafts and honest about windows, because the lake turns fibs into invoices by February. Meanwhile, a good landlord is worth more than a discount that moans in a storm. Seals beat views. Crime talks like it does in any city built from ports and grit, yet blocks differ more than headlines do. However, walk the evening loop before you sign, and let your feet decide which corners keep their promises at 9. Meanwhile, the safest bargain is the one near elders, bus lines, and stubborn porch lights. Lights don't lie. Culture here is a bonfire rather than a chandelier, and people gather by heat instead of spectacle. However, galleries, hockey nights, and powwow calendars weave a rhythm that refuses to shrink just because the map does. Meanwhile, a sunrise over Superior makes courage feel like a discount you carry in your pocket all day. Dawn lowers prices. From Big Lake to Big Rain, fly east. Okay, so this one is finally number 1, St. John's, NL. St. John's looks hand-painted at noon and salt-washed by 4, and the houses keep their colors as if defying the sky. However, the rent line that matters sits roughly $700 to $850, and the number that sticks is $770, while rainfall climbs like a local sport. The paint never surrenders. The economy here walks with a fisherman's gait, steady when the sea approves and thoughtful when it does not. However, For a retiree, the essential calculation is less boom and bust and more butcher and bus stop, both of which behave predictably. Meanwhile, friendliness arrives without suspicion, and it stays even after the forecast turns unpolite. Greetings beat forecasts. Weather is not background music in St. John's, it is percussion, and sometimes it drums sideways. However, fog muffles streets that were laughing a moment ago, and wind decides which hats are local and which were born inland. Meanwhile, umbrellas retire early, but good rain gear earns its keep by noon. Coats are citizens. Flights, like temperaments, vary with the fronts, and the tarmac writes haiku about delay and arrival. However, airfare volatility is a budget line you can tame with patient booking, shoulder seasons, and a willingness to leave at inconvenient hours. Meanwhile, the reward for timing is a full table of family 2 provinces away at a price that behaves. Dawn flights save weeks. Groceries and fuel tilt dearer than in central Canada, though not enough to break the math if the rent cooperates. However, cod still appears on plates as if history cooked dinner, and local bakeries play defense against the gray. Meanwhile, a small pantry stacked for storms feels less like fear and more like citizenship. Pantries are policies. Healthcare access is a straightforward handshake most days, and the specialists are less theatrical than in bigger markets. However, storm day disruptions redraw clinic hours without courtesy, which is why telemedicine and rescheduling discipline matter like winter tires. Meanwhile, pharmacists wear the calm of experience and remember names with a smile that shortens afternoons. Names thaw minutes.